Hello. In my previous video, I talked a little bit about when you happen to have extra produce or a friend brings by fresh produce and you're trying to figure out what to do with it. That's me right now. I've kind of let these onions sit for just a little long, and I have even some more. These ones look like they're starting to sprout, which means I need to use them or they're going to go bad. So when I need to use onions and I don't have a dish in mind, I usually candy them. And this may not be the typical French way to do candied onions, but I think it's the basic idea. And usually it's low, slow heat, and there has to be butter. There's got to be butter somewhere in that recipe. So the first thing that I do with onions when I'm getting ready to prep them is I peel them. So right now I'm getting ready to cut these onions. I have some red ones. I'm assuming they're probably sweet. And then I've got a yellow onion. Not sure if it's sweet or not. I just acquired these onions. It really doesn't matter when you're candying onions. If you're trying to impress a crowd, maybe you want to get all one kind of onion. Probably a sweet one like a Vidalia would be good. The higher the sugar content, the better this candied onion is going to be. So I have a really sharp knife, and I like to use my sharpest knife for cutting onions because they're slippery, and I like to have my onion sliced pretty thin, especially, when you candy it, you kind of want, it's gonna break down a lot and get super soft. So having like a nice uniform cut is just nicer to eat, and it looks nicer too. So now I'm going to go ahead and peel them. Peeling an onion is pretty much just chopping off either end of the onion at the bottom of the bulb, and then you should be able to just peel off the skin. Now, if the skin seems to be sticking to the actual onion's surface, I then will make like a slit in the side, just like a little bit. And then I'll start to peel from the slit, and that'll sometimes help it move along faster. Now I've got my onions peeled. Got them peeled. And I'm going to chop them pretty thin. But I think, just to make it easier on me, because this is going to hurt my eyes, I'm actually going to chop the onion in half first. So I'll have these two halves. And then I'll chop it just once the long way. But I will try to make the slices as thin as possible. And if you don't know how to use a knife, you want to keep your fingers kind of rolled in, and then your knuckles should touch the top of the knife. This way your fingers are never in the way of the knife, but you just kind of use a circular motion to get a steady slice. And then my slices, I'm keeping them kind of thin, just sort of like that. I like them really thin, and I like them really uniform, because then when they break apart, they're all sort of the same size. So I'm going to get them all sliced up. Now I've got my onions peeled and chopped, and they are all ready to put into my cast iron pot. Okay, we've got the medium size and then the smaller size. And I'm going to use the smaller size for these onions because they will cook way, way, way down. So you don't really need, unless you're doing a giant batch of onions, to have a very big pan, because they're just going to cook down to almost nothing. The whole thing about candying onions is not only are you browning them, but you're getting out so much of the water, and in doing so you're bringing out the sugars in the onion. This is why you don't want to make the heat very hot, and you don't want to cook the onions fast, because all that will happen then is that the onions will burn. You don't want the onions to burn. You want them to be sweet and brown. So I'm just going to get two things into my little cast iron pan. I'm going to put a little bit of coconut oil, just because the burning point of coconut oil is much, much higher than butter. So it can stay in that pan and keep those onions lubricated for a lot longer than butter can. But I've noticed that the Maillard effect, this is the effect that happens when cookies brown or when butter browns. Anything that has butter in it will have a Maillard effect as long as it doesn't burn. It will get that brown, caramelly looking color and smell. But in order to get that in the onions, you need butter. Butter, butter, butter. I don't think I've tried every other kind of oil with onions, and just the only thing that gets that nice candied effect is butter. So I'm not going to need much. This isn't very much onions, so I'll probably do like a tablespoon of coconut oil and then maybe a tablespoon of butter, and that should set me up. There I've got my tablespoon of coconut oil, that's the whiter oil, and then I've got my tablespoon of salted butter. And I'm just going to get that so that it's melted enough to cover the pan. I don't want the butter to start cooking before the onions are in it. So that's about what I want it to look like before I put my onions in. I'm going to go ahead and shovel those onions in there. It's really at this point just a matter of putting them into the cast iron. I've got the stove set to about 3 because I'm really trying to get these to cook really slow. I want to leach the water out. I do not want to burn these onions. If you find that it's heating up just a little bit too slowly, you can turn the heat up for a minute or 2, but once you see it really start to get going, turn it back down, because these will burn really quickly, and that is not the effect that you want. Now, another really cool thing to do, a delicious thing to add, is some sherry wine or some kind of red wine. I don't have any, but once these start to get sort of brown, that's something that I've done in the past, is pour a little bit of wine in there for some extra kind of flavor. But you definitely want to get them browning first, because once you put in another kind of liquid, that's going to slow the browning process. So I put a lid on, and this will probably be heating up and steaming for like, I don't know, maybe 20 minutes to closer to a half hour before I'm starting to see these onions sweat. And what that means is they will start to look a little bit translucent. That's good. That means that the water's coming out. But they really need to get almost all the water out and then start to get hot and brown before they're going to candy. Now, the butter in that coconut oil will help sustain it until that point, but eventually you're going to need to add some liquid back in. I'll let you know what it looks like at that point. Here you can see the really beginning stages of what happens when the onions start to sweat. The light's not really good in here, but if you could really see, there's actually like little droplets of water coming off of those onions. The reason that it's not smoking more and that it's not getting really dark brown yet is because I don't have that heat very high. It's only set to like 3. That's really low. And I'm doing that on purpose because I don't want to burn the onions. So this is stage 1. This is the onions sweating. And as they start to sweat for a little while longer, they're going to shrink way down. And at that point, they're going to start to turn just a little bit brown. And when that happens, you want to give it a stir to make sure that it's getting all evenly browned. And then you just wait for some of that water to cook down. So now the onions have started to brown. Hopefully you can kind of see that. I've been stirring them a little bit, and we're waiting. We're waiting for them to get way more brown than that. Because again, once they get that brown, you're going to add in a little bit more liquid. We'll check back. This is that point I was talking about when the onions lose all their water and they're brown. And they're brown enough where they're going to start to burn if I don't add something to them. So what I'm going to do is add about a tablespoon or 2 of water. And I'm going to do that probably, I don't know, every 2 to 3 minutes, or just check back to make sure that that water isn't totally burning off, because I want this to brown for longer. and it needs a little bit of help because it will dry out otherwise, and you do not want this to burn. So here I've added just a bit of water, and you can see it's kind of boiling and bubbling a little bit, and that's good. That's going to give us more time to get more of those sugars to come out of those onions, because I want them to be even more brown than that. The browner, the sweeter. So we wait. I'm going to say at this point maybe another 10 minutes. That should probably be long enough to get them to where we want. Now with these onions, you may need to add water a couple more times. If you see the onions starting to kind of stick and maybe burn a little bit around the edges, and you're not convinced that it's brown and sweet enough for you to take it off, then it's time to add just a titch more water. And also what that's going to help do is get some of that caramelized sugar off of the pan and into the onion slurry that you are creating, this beautiful onion slurry. So water is good at this point, just a little bit, because you also don't want to waterlog this. The point is not to make it wet, it's just to lubricate it a little bit so you can buy some time to get some more of that sugar out. So once it's done, I'm going to come back and I'm going to show you. Check that out. Look how brown, and also look how much it cooked down. I did not actually need to add any more water. The one time was enough. And I think I'm going to call it good to go. So yeah, that's pretty much what it looks like when it's done. And it's sweet, and it'll be buttery and caramelly. That's the kind of thing that it's kind of like what you have when you have a French onion soup without all that salt. It's just the sweet, sticky, cooked innards and guts of a beautiful onion. This would be something that would be really nice to add to a steak if you're a steak person. It'd be super good with eggs. You could pretty much add it to, well, anything savory. Maybe like a quiche, or you could put it with pork and maybe some cranberries, some sauteed cranberries. There's just like limitless things you can do with candied onions. It's so delicious to eat them. You could put them with fresh cornbread, a little bit of butter, but I like to have them around just as a base. They're really useful in dishes, and you can totally just freeze them and have them ready to go. When you just want a meal on the go, you can just defrost them and add some too. So I like to freeze stuff in little portions. That'll be like a whole nother video, but I'll make little Tupperwares of these depending on how many I think I'm going to use, and then I can pull one out and just add it to a meal whenever I'm ready. Or sometimes I have a meal already in mind, and then I add them into that meal and freeze that whole meal. But yeah, these are good to go. So you just dish them out, put them in whatever you want to store them in. They'll keep in the fridge for probably a week or so, and they'll keep in the freezer for a very long time, probably a year if you wanted. And bon appetit. That is how you make candied onions from scratch.